1, 2, testing. Are we? Yes, we are. Okay. Hi, guys. Hope you're good. And hope everything is going well with you in this week 3 of ours, where we are going to be discussing family. So this week we are focusing on constructions of the family in the South African context. And so, what we are going to look at, I am going to try and give you an overview of what you need to be focusing on. And I mean, family is one of those things that we love to hate. And more often than not, we actually do not know that we love to hate it. And so we actually tend to hate to love it. But in any case, that's enough wordplay from me today. So, what do we mean when we talk about constructions of the family? So, first of all, we need to understand what family is and therefore how we can approach family from a South African context. And I know saying how do we approach family from a South African context almost makes the implication that to talk about family within a South African context is totally different to talking about family, say, for example, from an American, a British, a Japanese, Indonesian, Mozambican perspective. But in as much as there are similarities, there are also subtle differences. And for me, what we need to focus more are those subtle differences, precisely because those differences can also exist at a number of levels. Because one, they could just be plain differences. We do it this way, you do it another way. But at the same time, these differences can actually imply ontological distinctions within how we characterize what family is. And when we talk about ontological distinctions, this is where we are saying our definition or our understanding of what family is actually becomes a deal breaker to the extent that what we mean by family becomes radically removed from everyone else's conception of family. And so that is what we are going to be looking at. Or another way of understanding these differences is not so much as ontological distinctions, but probably fundamental differences. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is the difference between a fundamental difference and an ontological difference? A fundamental difference can either exist at the level of function or at the level of form. When we talk about differences that exist at the level of function, we are just saying we have different people performing different roles within our family, and that is what breeds uniqueness in our understanding of family. And when we talk about form, we are actually talking about the constitution of the family. How is the family constituted? And the differences between one place and another might actually imply or signify a fundamental break in how people understand what family is. But when we talk about ontological differences, we're actually saying these are the kind of differences that take a thing beyond how it can be expressed in every dimension of its manifestation to ultimately becoming something that is truly singular in its existence. So there is nothing quite like it when we talk about family. So those are what we call ontological differences. And so these are some of the conversations that we are going to be having as we talk about family. Now, the best way for you to actually understand family and its dynamics in both structure and function is by looking firstly at the functions of the family. And for this, we are going to borrow quite heavily from anthropology and sociology, precisely because these two disciplines were heavily involved in carving out our understanding of what a family unit is. So before we go to the functions, we need to understand that a family or the family unit is understood as the fundamental building block of society. What do we mean? What we mean is the individual instance of family represents the building block of communities and society. So when we talk about society, it is an assemblage, it is a conglomeration, it is a union, it is a coalescence of families that come together to provide or to produce something bigger. One way of looking at it is we can borrow ideas from Yuri Bronfenbrenner when he talks about the um, ecological model. And he says right at the center of his ecological model is the individual. But that individual is actually captured or encapsulated in what he calls the microsystem. And so within the context of that microsystem, this is where we talk about family as being a microsystem, but also your place of work, your group of friends, all of these things are part and parcel then of the microsystem. Then we have the mesosystem. Now, the mesosystem is the interaction of multiple micro um, microsystems. So what I want to look at directly is with regards to family. So your family is a nuclear family. There are also other families that exist in and around you, and with varying levels of proximity. And when we talk about these proximity, you need to understand that we have proximity in relation to space and we have proximity in relation to relatedness. For example, you might not necessarily be as close knit with your neighbors, but they are closer to you spatially, geographically, than your first cousins. So, relationally, with your first cousins, you are closer, but not necessarily in terms of geographic space. So, think about it. Your community is made up of your family, your neighbors, to the sides, and so it becomes a conglomeration of families. And this is precisely what necessitated what's his name, Philip Zimbardo, to do research on his social disorganization theory, where he suggested that a breakdown of the family unit will always lead to a breakdown in societal structures. And therefore, communities and societies where the family unit is broken down is ultimately going to be highly susceptible to a variety of social ills. So, from that perspective, we can actually see, or we can use Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological model to make sense of family dynamics that can also be expressed from the perspective of Philip Zimbardo's social disorganization theory. So this social disorganization theory, as I've stated it, indicates that solid communities and societies that have the right moral compass, that possess the right kind of symbiotic relationships where it is a give and take, where you would ordinarily get that idea that it takes a village to raise a child. Those kinds of communities are only possible if the fundamental building block of those communities is intact. Now, that fundamental building block is the family. So, families are the fundamental building blocks of society, and families are characterized by the functions that they perform. So, first and foremost, we have, and remember, I know I am speaking from a classical perspective. We are going to talk a little bit more as time goes on about a modern manifestation of some of these functions. But in a classical sense, to talk about a family is to talk about production. So production takes place in a family precisely because the family is understood as being the building block of community or of society. So production, but what do we mean by production? We mean hunting and gathering and foraging for food. And in our present context, members within the family go to work and they earn a salary. And so that is production within the context of the household. And where there is production, there is also a pooling of resources, not Pull, no, Pool. We bring our hunted stuff and our gathered stuff together. We put it into one huge pile and we all eat from there. What does that mean, or what is the implication? Kids might not necessarily be going out to do foraging or work, but they still eat from what has been pulled together by all the individuals from within that family that work. So we have production, we have pulling of resources, we have reproduction. Now, when we talk about reproduction, and remember, I am talking about all of this from the context of a classical understanding of the functions of the family. And there is a reason why I'm starting with the classical understanding of family function and family formation. So, reproduction, it was understood that children, let me put it correctly, legitimate children are the ones that are born into families. And so the production of the young, where a mother and a father were understood as being the core of the productive process. Now, the moment we talk about reproduction in this context, we also then automatically talk about one, the nuclear family as being central, because what are we saying? It is the mother and the father that are responsible for the production of new babies or the production of legal babies, because illegitimate children and the very concept of illegitimacy is highly contested now. But back in the day, a child would be illegitimate if it was born out of wedlock. And that understanding leads us to yet another function of the family, the regulation of sex. Because since sex was also highly linked to reproduction, the family as a unit would tend to make the determination of who would have sex. So a mother cannot have sex with the daughter, cannot have sex with the son. A father cannot have sex with the daughter, cannot have sex with the son. But And sister cannot have sex with brother, or sisters cannot have sex with each other, neither can brothers have sex with each other. And the reason for the regulation of sex was to maintain some form of purity. And that kind of purity was always based on a social construction of what is understood as incest taboo. So incest taboo was that very idea that limited sexual union, or if you are more traditional, sexual congress between particular individuals. And these rules were made up within the context of the family. And as they cascaded outwards into the society, and by society, we also mean other families, this literally became a norm. So, a norm within a given area is a negotiated understanding of the procedure or the right procedure of a thing. And the rightness of the procedure isn't determined by some, um, you know, distinct or well-known articulation of what is right and wrong. It was always determined by how we give it sense, because through our interactions, we tend to produce meaning. Last week, we looked at the symbolic and interactionist approaches that helped to explain what culture is, where we were saying cultural forms and cultural norms only get purchased through the way they are created as a direct result of people's interactions. And so when we talk about family, especially in this context, the same thing applies. So who can have sex with who? So we've said we had production, we have reproduction, we have the regulation of sex, we also have the care of the young, the old, the sick, and the elderly. So the function of care is also taking place in the family. But in more traditional societies, we also had education. So, and education was always intricately tied with socialization. So, the process of socialization is the process of inducting new members of a society to the society. And the reason why the family became the primary ground on which socialization would take place is precisely because that is where reproduction was understood as taking place. And so the legitimate kids that are born of that particular union are actually inducted into being members of that family and members of that society. So socialization, if you will, for others who, for their own political reasons, which are neither right nor wrong, but they are valid for them, socialization can also be understood as indoctrination. Or if you take a look at the epidemiological explanation for family that we spoke about last week, where we said society is a virus that actually requires the host, which is people, in order for it to continue to exist. So in this instance, socialization is the infecting of new members by or with the virus of family and society. Why? Because they are a host, and interactions become the vector through which this multi-generational infection with ideas of unity, solidarity, community, and family and bond are transmitted to the next generation. All right. So we also have the protection of family members. So in today's world, we talk about the police and the army doing the protecting. The legal system, the legal justice system is responsible for that. But back in the day, it was all done by the family, including, well, we did talk about health because taking care of the old, the sick, the young, and the elderly all revolved not just around uh, a provision of a safety net for people who cannot provide for themselves, but also taking care of them spiritually as well as physically in a medical sense, because you would use your mutis and stuff like that. So this is what we call the traditional understanding of family. But as families or as societies continued to develop, there was the evolution of what is known as structural differentiation. Now, structural differentiation is a process whereby more simple societies are transformed into more complex societies. And the most significant marker of that transition from being simple to being complex revolved around structural differentiation. And for those who structural differentiation is too much of a big word, think about it as outsourcing. So as families or as societies developed, there was a need to send children to school in order for them to get more formalized education. So the family outsourced teaching to schools. uh, Structural differentiation. Structural differentiation in the sense that the structure responsible for the performing of a particular function has been outsourced to yet another structure that is more formalized and more institutionalized. So, for example, rather than having your father as the family priest, we now go to a church where, or a synagogue, or any house of worship where we have a more centralized uh, form of religious experience, where we had your father and older brothers protecting you. We now have outsourced that responsibility to law enforcement. And so the process of development of communities led to structural differentiation, where we were now differentiating particular functions. So, for example, production within the family context, back in the day, that was farming, and it was labor intensive, and we needed more people, and so we needed more families. But today, a person can go to work and literally buy their 12.5 kg of milli meal. So you don't even need to plant anything. And so the people that are producing the food that we eat, we've structurally differentiated. We have outsourced that. So in exchange for other people producing the food for us, we now go to work, earn money so that we can buy the food they produce. And so all of this is family dynamics and how they are continuing to evolve. So as I had said, in order for us to understand what the family is, we need to understand that it is comprised of its functions. Now, as families continue to evolve, uh, we see further structural differentiation, as well as having new members within the family performing functions that were ordinarily performed by others back in the day. For example, our classical understanding of what a family unit is, which is a mother and a father and their two kids, preferably one boy, one girl. And that was, you know, all of our family unit. So reproduction, for example, mother and father would come together, but today that's not always the case because now there is adoption as a means of adding more members of the family to the family. And so the function of reproduction might not necessarily be present in the home. And even though it might not be in the home, there are still other functions that would remain intact. For example, socialization. So ordinarily, where primary socialization was the sole preserve of the family in general, but predominantly the mother, now we even have gay parents where we have two fathers in the home, and both fathers are now responsible for primary socialization, which never used to be the case. So, as the more that our families change, we tend to see that some of the functions that were being performed by particular individuals back in the day are now being performed by other individuals. So, in terms of production, we would have the breadwinner typically as the father, but not so because we also have women headed households and we have stay at home dads. And that has completely upended our understanding of family. But the functions that need to be performed have remained intact, even though the people responsible for performing those functions have changed, but the functions still continue to exist. Now, when we talk about the dynamics of the family, we need to understand that South Africa's cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity significantly shapes family structures and dynamics. And so historically, colonialism and apartheid policies disrupted indigenous family systems, replacing extended kinship models with a nuclear arrangement in some contexts. And this is exactly what we've been talking about, that we have in the classical sense an understanding of what family is. But straight off the bat, you can immediately tell that the family from the sort of classical understanding of the term is a mishmash between more traditional African families based on African cultures, but there's also an amalgamation of the European style nuclear family. And so we need to understand that families on the South African in South Africa are quite different, and we can't really say that one is better than the other. What we can rather say is that all are valid. And depending on the kind of political point that you're trying to make, we can always find advantages and disadvantages for particular families. However, deficits that exist in particular families should not necessarily be seen or associated with weaknesses of entire family clusters that are under such a category. We need to understand the individual dynamics of particular families, also given the context where those families are, where they are located socially and economically, as well as their relationship with the historical formation that created a hierarchization of family units within the South African context. So we have extended families, and these are quite common in African cultures. I mean, we even have, what do you call it? It's not a reality show. Now, could it is a reality show about this guy with four wives and trying to marry a fifth, where he is trying to get to 20 kids, or at least that's what I heard, and then maybe now it's 100 or something like that. So he wants to keep adding more wives. So we know from a sort of Euro-Western conception, we can talk about bigamy. We can talk about polygamy. We can also talk about polyandry and polyamorous relationships. And all of these are different kinds of families, but we've extended. And so there's a change in family structure. And that change in the family structure, as we've been looking at it, literally feeds into differences in the functions that are being performed by the family as well as who performs those functions. Then we also have issues such as migration that tends to both split up particular families as well as to mesh together different others. Because in our South African context, we cannot run away from the politics of um, having migrants marrying locals and the kind of politics associated with whether those can constitute legal marriages, because we know Home Affairs actually investigates, especially when the kids or the migrant partner wants to get legal papers to be a permanent resident or be a South African citizen based on marriage. And so there's all of these things that are now beginning to take place where the state is inserting itself into families. And that's not necessarily a new thing. To suggest that would be erroneous and tantamount to some nefarious political agenda. The state has always had a stake in families, which is the reason why we've always had social welfare as long as we've had. Why? Because the state is invested in the development of families. And for most of you that are going to be looking at community psychology at some point in the future, I always give the birthplace of community psychology as being South Africa. Why? Because during 1930, 1931, the Carnegie Commission, which was an institute based in the US, was commissioned by the South African government at the time to address what was known as the poor white problem. So poor white people, because of their poverty, were always physically in the same spaces as Black people because they could only afford to live in the same kind of areas. And so the South African government was saying, we do not want these people to intermix. So we need to figure out what we can do. And so they tasked the Carnegie Commission in 1931 to conduct research on how to address the problem of poor white people in South Africa that were muddying their race by sleeping with Black people and creating the colored community. And that's not to say that's the only source of colored community. There's an entire politics, but anyway, I'm not going to get into that now. Right now, what I do want to talk about is how the state was invested in families for the longest time. So the recommendations of the Carnegie Commission were that we need to separate Black people from white people, not just physically in terms of where do these people stay, but we also need to do that conceptually so that they live in completely different spaces. And so, as a direct result of the recommendations of this commission, Black people could not earn as much as white people. So people that are doing the same amount of work could not be paid the same on the basis of race. Why was that important? Precisely because if white people and Black people could afford to live in the same places, Black people and white people would ultimately end up living together. So let there be a distinction between what you earn. And so for the white families, they got a boost in their salaries while the Black families got a dock in theirs. And so that ultimately led to a difference. However, this difference in pay wasn't enough, it wasn't sufficient to prevent industrious Black people to earning enough to be able to buy property in white areas. And so the Group Areas Act was one of the recommendations. So now we are saying Black people and white people should not live in the same spaces. But what exactly are we doing? We are seeing the first full-scale community psychology intervention by the state as a way of addressing the challenges that are plaguing families, white families, at a family level. And so this is just evidence to suggest that we don't just see the state rearing its head, nosing around in families today because migrants are marrying locals. No, this is something that has always existed. And so the state has always had a stake. But when we talk about migrant families, we are talking about how migration ultimately breaks up families. I mean, we as South Africa have a tradition of people going to work in the mines. But what did working in the mines entail? It entailed that there was a separation because Black fathers were shipped off to the mines, maybe not unwillingly, but at the same time, there was a very direct consequence of that. And yes, I know I said at times not unwillingly, but at times it was forced in the sense that you need the money to pay your taxes, you need the money to do ABC, and where else can you get the money? But the direct byproduct was the splitting of families. But the splitting of families in that instance also led to what is now known as the hostel culture, because these men, as they were going into the mines, they actually formed new families while they were there. And in these new families, it's not to say that they completely abandoned the wife and kids in the rural areas. It just means that these were families of convenience where people would come together and just out of necessity be a family, or at least, at the very least, constitute a household. And we are going to talk about what a household is later on. But I'm just merely talking about how there was a splitting of families due to migration, as well as how there was the creation or the invention of new makeshift families within these new spaces where people found themselves in. But right now, post 1996, we also have same-sex families. So members of the LGBTQ plus community are now allowed to legally get married, and so that also constitutes families. However, putting it in those words does not necessarily imply that they wouldn't constitute a family if they are not married. No, we do have civil unions, people who live together for prolonged periods of time. The state actually recognizes the legitimacy of that unit as being a family. But you also don't just need the rubber stamping by the state to say that what you have constitutes a family, because family is what you make it. And because family is what you make it, we need to understand that the way we interpret family in its various and diverse forms quite literally legitimizes them. Now, we also need to consider gender and gender roles within families, because to talk about gender is to ultimately get into this space where we have to talk about not just LGBTQ plus communities, but to also look at the role that women play within the family unit. And we actually see, as we were saying earlier, that while traditionally the assumption was the husband is the one who goes out of the house to go and work, earn a salary, earn a wage, bring that money back to the house, the wife buys the groceries, and cooks the meals, that's not so much the case. And so what we are seeing is an evolution of the gender roles within the context of the family, precisely because there is an evolution of gender roles within society as a whole. So our very understanding of what a person is supposed to do on the basis of their gender is changing. And because of all of those changes, we actually need to come to the understanding that some of the things that held sway no longer do. I grew up, and so for some of you, it might be weird. I do look quite young, which is very good. Anyway, that's besides the point. But I grew up in a context where, in primary school, as well as parts of high school, when I was still in high school, some 20 odd years ago, um, we had subjects or technical subjects. So because male, I did agriculture and I also did what do you call this? Woodwork. Some friends of mine were doing metal work. But what were the girls doing? There were two subjects that they were doing. And yes, those two subjects are still there to this day. The names have changed. But during my time, there was what is known as home economics, and there was what is was called fashion and fabrics. Now, home economics was a subject that taught girls in primary school how to run a household. So already our education system was indoctrinating us with ideas of a clear distinction of gender roles within the family, precisely because little girls were taught home economics. And what do we mean by home economics? That's where you were taught how to cook, that's where you were taught how to create a budget. That's where you were taught how to iron your clothes. That's where you were taught how to wash or bathe your kids, how to keep a nice and tidy house. And so these little girls that were doing home economics, every single one of them needed to buy an apron, and you put on your apron as you are cleaning the classroom. They were taught how to sweep, how to mop the floor. They were taught how to apply floor polish and how to shine the floors. And so all of these are things that I distinctly remember, because my mom still has a textbook from when she took those classes. And I was quite amazed because I was telling her, yeah, no, these are the things that being taught. But at the time, and I suppose this speaks to the efficacy of the education system at the time, because I wasn't making reference to it in the sense that there was something strange about these girls doing all of this. What was strange to me was why these girls don't clean at home when they are taught how to clean at school. That for me is where the issue was. So I did not even question, because I didn't have a frame of reference where what I was seeing could have been construed otherwise. So there was distinct gender roles. If you're a woman, these are the things you had to do. If you're a man, these are the things that you had to do. And because of that, you begin to see that we cannot truly divorce the family as a unit from various other institutions within the community or the social setup, which then forces us to go back to our very first statement when we started saying we need to understand that the family unit is the fundamental building block of communities. Why are we going back? We are going back precisely because communities aren't just built by a conglomeration of families. There is also an infusion of institutions or social structures, or according to uh, Marxist sociologists, superstructures. So there is what they call infrastructure, there's also what they call superstructure. And there's also what they call structure, and there are also what they call institutions. And when we talk about institutions, we are talking about things such as schools. We've also institutionalized the family because we talk about the family institution, but we talk about the military, it's an institution. It is also a mechanism of control. When we talk about structures, we are in essence talking about the existence of different bodies or different elements. So between structures um, and institutions, the differences are slight. Uh, because when we talk about structure, especially from the perspective of a theoretical perspective known as structural functionalism. Structural functionalism, firstly, functionalism says anything that exists performs a function, which is why it exists. If it no longer ceases to be useful in society, it just dies off. But if it exists, it's functional, which is the reason why some people take it to its most illogical conclusion. What about dysfunctional elements? They are still functional, which is why they exist, because they serve as a warning sign and they serve as an indicator of the things that need to be targeted and eliminated in our societies for them to exist. So functionalism just says anything that exists is functional. Structural functionalism comes in and says the hierarchies that we see in societies are functional. So it is good for society that some people are dirt poor while others are filthy rich. It is functional in society for us to have people who do the work that we don't want. And it's also functional to have, enviable careers. It's good that medical doctors earn a gazillion and your mom, who is sweeping floors in a high-rise building, earns peanuts. So the existence of hierarchies within society is functional. Why? Precisely because the structures that are present in societies. So the cleaning category or structure is functional. So we cannot live as a modern society without Pick It Up, right? Which is the company that picks up our trash. And we cannot function if the guys that pick our trash would earn the same as doctors, because what then would be the incentive for going to work for multiple years and incurring the king's ransom worth of debt if we are going to pay our cleaners the same that we pay our doctors. So structural functionalism signifies that we do have different structures in society and it is functional for us to have that. So all of these things where we have some that are here and some that are here and some that are here, or some that are here and others that are right there, it's very functional. It enables our society to function. So those are the structures that we are talking about. Now, those structures, um, we talk about, the medical fraternity where we have our doctors and so on and so forth. We also have schools, and even within the schools, all schools are not built the same, right? And we have our history to thank for that, because we have some Model A schools and some Model C schools. And in some schools, people, the schools themselves are so under-resourced to the extent that even the government buys wrong books for them. Imagine that. Now, this is not necessarily an indictment of our government, but all I'm saying is that there are also schools that are so adequately resourced that you cannot even begin to imagine that this is a lab that is found at a primary school. Because there are some high schools that don't even have a fifth of what some schools have. So the privatization of education, religion, all of those things are structures. And when we talk about superstructures and infrastructure, we are literally talking about buildings. And that's where we get in the domain of the haves and the have-nots. So the haves, what do they have? They have capital, but they also have factories. These factories are the infrastructure. The superstructure is the economic superstructure that we are talking about. The very category of the haves is part of the superstructure. The very category of the have-nots is part of the superstructure in order for our society to live. And so why am I talking about these things? These things form a fundamental part of our families within the various spaces that they're in. So these institutions, these superstructures, these structures, these infrastructure are part and parcel of what make up societies in conjunction with the families that we find. And so when we now look at the contemporary changes, we look at, the fact that what is happening within the society is a microcosm of the macrocosm, where we are having women taking up leadership position outside the home, um, being mimicking the fact that women are also taking up leadership roles within the home. So we have women who are breadwinners. We have women that are leaders in Fortune 500 companies. Now, the kind of change that we want isn't coming fast enough, but it is taking place. But as they say, justice delayed is justice denied. Some have often concluded that the very fact that we aren't moving fast enough to get to a point of change where we want signifies that it is change denied. But wherever you fall on that argument, we cannot deny the fact that things are changing, maybe not as fast as we would want. And we also need to understand that there are various definitions or ways of understanding what is meant by family. Because family, even though the very category of family exists as a universal constant in the sense that regardless of where you go, the concept of family exists. What does differ is the constituents of the family, the function, and the form. So we can talk about within the South African context, the biological definition as a unit consisting of parents and their kids. And so this is built predominantly after the Western nuclear family model. We also have kinship networks. This is where we emphasize the extended family and clan-based kinship. For example, my clan is fish. Therefore, fish is my totem. I don't eat fish by extension. And so anyone who comes from my clan who is a fish, like myself, is my brother, is my sister, is my uncle, is my aunt. That's how it works. But we also have household-based approaches. Now, some scholars have defined family as those who share a home and economic resources regardless of biological ties. So, for example, we can have foster families, we can have polygamous households, or same-sex families. Now, These kinds of families might not necessarily be related by blood, but what constitutes a household is a unit that pulls their resources together and virtually performs most of the functions of the typical traditional family without the necessity of blood relations. So we can have a household amongst two friends that came to Joburg to look for work, and they are staying in the same room, and they help each other pay rent, and they help each other buy food. Those people actually constitute a household. All right. They are friends. They are not related by blood. They could be either related by clan kinship or not at all. I mean, this is the person you just grew up with or went to school with. You guys decided, let's just do something. You actually constitute a household. We also have legal definitions. And so, according to the South African law, it recognizes various family formations, including customary marriages, as well as same-sex unions. Now, I am referencing customary marriages and same-sex unions precisely because they have sort of existed outside of a popularized formation. For customary law, I say it is unrecognized, not because it isn't, but that legally it is a little troublesome. Why? Because the prevailing understanding of what a legal union is, you have to go to Home Affairs, have to have that marriage registered, and then, you do all of the legal formalities of tying yourself to that other person. But with customary law, these are people that might not even go to Home Affairs. They do our traditional lobola, and from our customary understanding, that does constitute a legal marriage. And after 1996, or was it 1998, we now have same-sex unions that are recognized, and after, oh goodness, I'm forgetting the year, but if I remember it, I'll tell you. Um, there was also the recognized legal marriages. And it's also interesting to note that the Vatican, is of, was it 2024 or 2023? I don't think it could have gone as far back as 2022, but it could. Anyway, the Vatican actually now recognizes same-sex unions. And so, even though, according to their terminologies, um, same-sex individuals cannot be legally married in the eyes of the church, but a church officiant, which is the priest, the Catholic priest, can bless your union. And I know it might not be what a lot of people are after, but believe me, that is something that is huge, especially coming from the fact that whenever same-sex unions were mentioned, back in the day, it would, especially within the context of the church, it would not miss the fire and brimstone that came down upon Sodom and Gomorrah uh, because of same-sex union, and for the church to say, you know what, our priests are allowed to bless the union. They are not allowed to legally marry you. So you can go have your legal marriage at Home Affairs, and then you can call your local Catholic priest. They will come and they will officiate a church blessing, where the church is blessing the union of these same-sex individuals. And so that is actually a very huge step in a direction of tolerance and acceptance. Then we also have chosen families, and you know same-sex unions as well as urban migrant communities. So you know how, imagine yourself and your girlfriend or your boyfriend, your partner. There's no monies that have exchanged in terms of lobola. You guys haven't gone to home affairs, and yet you have decided to actually stay together. So that actually is a form of a non-biological kinship structure that you guys are creating, especially when you add kids to that, which I think is absolutely amazing, because there isn't one way of being a family. And for us to even talk about the construction of a normal family, normal is a highly political term. And as a political term, it has always revolved around who's normal. And as I always say, the formula for normal is particular plus power is equal to normal. So whatever is particular to a particular group of people, if those people have sufficient amounts of power, then that particular trait ultimately becomes the norm. And this formula applies to almost everything, including international languages. So the formula for an international language, like English, French, German. I mean, these are the languages that people are now speaking. And now, very soon, Mandarin. Um, it's vernacular plus power equal to international language. So English is the vernacular spoken in the UK, and not even all of the UK, in England specifically. Because in Scotland they have Gaelic, and in Wales they have Welsh, and all of those are, not necessarily English in the traditional sense of the term. But English became a super language because of the power of the English. And so normal is just the particularities or the peculiarities plus power. That becomes the norm. And so we have Western norms where the nuclear family model, which is a heterosexual couple and their kids, became the dominant mode of understanding of the family. Then we also have the apartheid's influence on the family, which ultimately promoted the white nuclear family as the most ideal, and thereby disrupting the nonsensical extended families or polygamous families. I mean, because how do you even deal with that? So there was a marginalization of the extended and polygamous families. Then we also have post-apartheid realities where we are now talking about families are now more diverse, but we do still have certain societal norms that favor the two-parent system. We can talk about heterosexual households. We can also talk about hetero non-normative households. And these are households where same-sex couples live. And who knows, it's also no, I just learned a new word the other day, throuple. So that is couple, but for three people. Yeah, so you can form a throuple or a couple, and all of these are different manifestations of family. And so the implications of all of these things within the construction of the normal family is the marginalization of non-traditional families. So even the vilification or the sidelining of single parent households, because I also grew up in a community in a time where to be a single mother is almost unheard of. The only accepted single parent was a widower, because you couldn't just be unmarried and have kids What the hell is wrong with you? Or even divorce. And why would you even be divorced? And as I ask that question, I don't mean as in why are you signing divorce papers? The question is, why is the husband saying to you, I no longer want to be with you? Why is he divorcing you? What's wrong with you? So I grew up in such a time. Um, and we also have policy biases in terms of housing and child welfare, as well as inheritance laws. Because, I mean, what do you do in a same-sex couple? We always want to assume that our delightful and benevolent um, South African constitution holds everybody equal under the law. But the practice of the law is an entirely different ballgame from the constitution because the application is done by individuals who do not have the constitution in their hearts. Because we need to understand there's a distinction between political actors and actors of politics. So, for instance, we can have the government as a structure, as an entity that needs to be democratic in all of its dealings, but the agents of the government aren't necessarily democratic in and of themselves, which is often the reason why there exists a disparity between the brilliance of the South African Constitution and the absolute horror of how it is applied. And so there's always going to be policy biases. And all of these things tend to lead to a psychological impact on the families who do not fit this ideal family mode. But in essence, this also points towards the sort of proliferation of the family systems type intervention, where we need to actually bring families in for counseling because they aren't necessarily functioning at their best. And at times, some of the issues literally stem from how varied and unconventional the form of the families are, thereby affecting the functions of the family. And so in South Africa, we can literally talk about a variety of trends, family trends. So, for example, the decline in marriage rates. I mean, this isn't just happening in America. And I know, and I'm a dad, I'm totally going to go there, tell a dad joke about the decline in marriage. Do you know what the leading causes of divorce is? Marriage. I went there. But anyway, the idea is we do have declining marriage rates. And all of this is owing to a change, a fundamental change in the constitution of normal within societies, or rather, not the constitution of normal, but an attack on normal as a category that explains social reality, because what's normal is what's done, but what's done is not always what's normal. And so people will tend to fight about all of these things. And so we have an increase now in female-headed households, where we are saying over 40% of South African households are led by women. And it's often due to absent fathers, and there's a rise in multi-generational households. Now, I know we often stereotypically say um, members of the Indian community are the ones that will have multiple generations, but that's actually not always the case. Because I grew up staying with my own granny before she passed away. And I know for a time my younger brother, when he was married, was staying with us. at home. Well, he got married 10 years before I did. And by the time I got married, he had already two wives, progress. But anyway, the idea there is we can have multiple generations, not just in stereotypically within the Indian community. You find that everywhere, even within the Black community, because we stay with grandparents. And to talk about grandparents for people of my generation is to talk about my own dad's mom or my mom's mom or my dad's dad or my mom's dad. But that's not always the case. I can be staying with my parents and have my own kids in that same household. And so the fact that my kids are in the same house with their grandparents, that's a thing now. And we do have a rise in this. And there's also growth in LGBTQ plus families, even though they are still facing a lot of social stigma, and they have to navigate, a lot of legal hurdles in order for them to get recognition. But these are things that are happening, and we also have digital communication that has reshaped family interactions. So the fact that I can speak to my wife on Zoom or on Teams or on WhatsApp, I can still keep in touch with distant family members. I mean, for crying out loud, we've got WhatsApp family groups now and Facebook family groups where, regardless of where we are, the bonds that bind are always being sharpened and reinforced. But also, as a result of economic uncertainty and well being, there's also a delay within the start of, you know, families, especially given how economic uncertainty sort of threatens um, the male's role within the family and their ability to actually take care of the family. All of these things have the family at their mercy. So these are things that we need to understand, and this is family. I have tried to give you as much as I can in a short amount of time so that at least I don't bore you by going on and on and on. But in any case, thank you guys so very much. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.